Welcome to Relative Time, Little Time. I'm Shep Steiner, Associate Professor of Contemporary Art and Theory at the University of Manitoba and editor of the journal Mosaic. I want to welcome you to our lecture series, which is almost coming to an end with a few more rescheduled events, but we have a very exciting group of scholars today. We developed the lecture series, Relative Time, Little Time, with the Dutch collaborative artist team, Vic van der Poel and Jos and Elizabeth are joining us today. Before I thank our sponsors and introduce our speakers, I want to acknowledge the traditional land on which the University of Manitoba campuses are located, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene nations, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the traditional land on which the University of Manitoba, we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Can everyone make sure that all of your, yeah, thank you, you're muted. Let me say that again. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes on which the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you to our sponsors, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the University of Manitoba Sponsorship Program, and lastly, the Faculty of Arts, the School of Art, and the Institute for the Humanities, all at the University of Manitoba. We'll have short question periods at the end of each of the 4 lectures we have today, and realize you will be recorded. Your consent is appreciated. My co-host Carolyn DeCorno, Mosaic's managing editor, or Timothy Brown, our conference assistant, will unmute you. It's always appreciated if you ask your questions with cameras on, but this is not necessary. Lastly, I remind you that on Thursday, March 3rd at 1 p.m., Etienne Turpin and Anna Sophia Springer will talk to us on their collaborative exhibition-led inquiry called Resembling Nature. Now to welcome our invited speakers, Doctors Chigbo Arthur Anyaduba, Melanie Braith, Singh Matharoo, and Melanie Dennis Unrau. Each of the speakers will present their lectures for about 20-25 minutes, and I'll give a fuller introduction to each of our speakers after the short question periods. So first, Dr. Arthur Anyaduba is assistant professor in the English department at the University of Winnipeg. He focuses his research on African and Black African diaspora literatures. Currently, he's researching cultural representations of genocidal mass atrocities in Africa. He's the author of the post-colonial African genocide novel, Quests for Meaningfulness, from 2021. His lecture today is titled A Great Universal Future Equitably Open to All Peoples, All Nations, and All Species, Decoloniality Beyond Openness. Please welcome Arthur Anyaduba.
Thank you. Can I share my screen now?
Yes.
Can everyone see my screen? Great. All right. Thanks a lot, Shep, for inviting me and for this opportunity. And thanks to everyone at Mosaic for the work you are doing. So basically, what I hope to do today is to provide some provisional thoughts on a vision of decolonization that has gained or gaining currency, particularly in the recent works of the African philosopher Achille Mbembe, who sees this decolonial framework as fitting for our contemporary time. A contemporary time that is a child of the anti-colonial struggles of the mid-20th century, especially in Africa. And this decolonial vision and the practices it seemed to have inaugurated, I think, has come to be described loosely by Mbembe using the word Afropolitanism, a word that attempts to track the complex and dynamic movements and mobilities of peoples, ideas, identities, wealth, cultures, and so on in Africa and in other places. And it is, according to Mbembe, Afropolitanism in this sense is a migrant and circulatory form of modernity born out of overlapping genealogies at the intersections of multiple encounters with multiple elsewheres. And this is something he espoused in this book called Out of the Dark Night, and in some of his recent works. And Mbembe deploys this vision, or his vision of Afropolitanism, as a kind of aspirational politics of decolonization in the contemporary time to serve as a planetary response to a global condition of movements of species, which in part is meant to underline, as he puts it, above all, the body of a vast world diaspora, which by definition is a body in motion, a deterritorialized body constituted in the crucible of various forms of migrancy. And I think nothing in recent years seems to capture the profundity of this condition of hypermobility and movement than the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in its widespread and circulatory mobilities. But anyway, it begs the question, therefore, for me, how the ethics and politics of decolonization has come to be vested in the acknowledgement of the complex movements and mobilities of peoples, of ideas, and the kinds of shifts happening in the material world. And I think to understand this shift may require some detour, even if schematically done, as I hope to do, into the nature of the colonial logics that informed this brand of decoloniality, at least in African context. So since the 15th century, when the first European, actually Portuguese Christian missionaries gained access into Africa, specifically in the Congo region, the logic of their economic and cultural missions was largely run or based on a religious sensibility that had long taken firm root in Europe. First, in the creation of Satan as the master of all evils, and in the different practices and wars enacted in the effort by Europeans to exorcise Satan from the world. And Africa offered yet another dimension to the twist and became, in the colonial Europe's mind, Satan's abode, a place of darkness and evil. In other words, the abode of dark desires of half peoples ruled by chaos and needing to be saved from themselves. And this violent logic provided the governing rationale and technology that turned Africans into chattel objects of enslavement for the maximization of European wealth and life. So as organized religious thinking declined in Europe and elsewhere in the Americas as the authoritative force of knowledge, and science increasingly gained ascendancy, authorizing more acceptable vocabularies for what must be understood as empirical knowledge. Racism, the science of races, emerged to consolidate and continue the logic of demonization that the old European religious imagination had inaugurated. And Africans and all other peoples designated as Blacks or racialized as inferior to whites continued to be imagined and treated as outcasts of history, those that Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth upon whom European dreams could be enacted. So the colonial world across different dispensations was governed by this logic of demonization and outcasting of people from the abode of what was considered the human or the human world. Or as Fanon describes it, this colonial world was governed by a Manichaean logic that waged a permanent warfare against colonized peoples by casting them in a perpetual condition of wrongfulness and darkness. So the organizing metaphor of this colonial world is in fact the image of the house or the mansion or the hall or colonial hall of civilization that barred entrance to non-white peoples. And just as European imaginary of a Satan cast out of a heavenly palace, or of the so-called first parents, Adam and Eve, locked out of their Edenic paradise on account of some sin or evil that they committed, so too were those it imagined as embodiments of evil closed out of this human world, barred therefore from any significant access to the mansion of colonial history and of its civilization. So the world and its future by this colonial logic must be secured by locking out those others whose presence threaten the divine balance. They must be seen as a blot on the divine way and hence cast out. So it's perhaps understandable that the struggles enacted by colonized peoples against this form of colonial violence envisioned the process of freedom largely as demands for access into the halls of colonial mansion. And these anti-colonial struggles had to contend with the enormous task of fashioning a freedom that doesn't only reckon with the attack to the physical and material world of colonized peoples, but also, and even more so perniciously, the attacks on the epistemological and metaphysical worlds of the colonized. And I think it's for this reason that Mbembe remarks that the aim of anti-colonialism was to create a new form of reality, emancipation from what was most intolerable and unbearable in colonialism, its dead force, and then the constitution of a subject who at origin would first refer to itself, and in referring first to itself, to its pure possibility and free apparition, would inevitably relate to the world, to others, to an elsewhere. If there is an intellectual, moral, or political heritage of African nationalism worth our energy in contemporary conditions, it is in this direction that it must be sought, in the message of joy in a great universal future, equitably open to all peoples, all nations, and all species. And so the goal of this vision of decolonization is not simply in the emancipation of oneself and one's land, but also in the establishment of a new ethical and political orientation that raises all things, or as Fanon puts it, in the cultivation of a new man who would not operate on the same patterns of European colonial logic, but instead be the source of openness. So this logic is governed by a politics of what Mbembe describes as an ascent to humanity, as against the colonial house with keys and doors to provide, to keep people in or out based on the governing racism of colonialism. This vision of decolonization is to establish, as Mbembe would have it, a house without keys and doors. In other words, an open house. Perhaps in this COVID time, it's become even more clear to many that indeed the constituting form of modern countries is the house with huge doors and intricate keys, and that this house can be locked up and down in different ways to keep people in or out. And those people, especially those historically cast outside, who have continuously been calling attention to this condition of doors and locks, should be given at least the credit for devising and championing the kinds of politics and ethics of a cosmopolitan drive as the basis for reforming contemporary relationships and engagements. But what's, for me, the relationship of this cosmopolitan vision of openness to African anti-colonial and decolonization struggles? particularly following the anti-colonial struggles of the mid-20th century that led to the independence of what today is generally known as the post-colonial African states. For many, such as Mbembe, it should be understood that the failures of anti-colonial struggles in Africa are largely to do with the failure to realize a viable cosmopolitan vision of the decolonization project in Africa. The vision, as Fanon touched, to establish a new logic, one that is open to all peoples. And this failure is mostly expressed in the patterns of post-independence conflicts in Africa. Most of these conflicts, according to this criticism, have been based on nationalistic visions that repeat the logic of the colonial house with doors and keys. And this failure is mostly the enabler of genocide in post-colonial Africa. And one may detect, perhaps in support of this critique or this notion of failure, a trend whereby mass atrocities were perpetrated in the name of nationhood, based on the idea of getting rid of those who do not or should not belong. In other words, on the idea of purifying the body politic, of closing the door and locking out undesirables. This is what Mahmoud Mamdani has called the natives genocide in the context of Rwanda. This is the genocide perpetrated by those who were racialized by colonizers as natives and who, considering themselves as the autochthons with inalienable rights to the land, turned against those racialized as settlers or foreigners during the time of anti-colonial and nationalist struggles. And their visions of the nation were narrowly defined around particularized colonial ideas about ethnic or racial identities that rested on the idea of nativity. Hence, Mamdani describes this form of genocide as the natives genocide. And the notion of the natives genocide seems applicable in some other post-colonial African contexts. And for example, the genocide of the Omani people of Arab descent by Zanzibaris in what is now commonly known as Zanzibar Revolution of 1964 was based on the perception of Omani people as alien settlers and non-indigenous in the country. Likewise, the massacres of Igbo peoples across Nigeria from 1966 through the Biafra-Nigeria War of 1967 to 1970 was based on xenophobic practices that identified the Igbo as settlers in parts of the country in which they were targeted for elimination. And similarly, the mass atrocities witnessed during the so-called civil wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone, which in part began as the natives' revolution against descendants of freed slave settlers from Europe and the Americas, and the massacres in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Burundi around the same time, among several other places in post-colonial Africa. These conflicts bear traces of the native settler friction. And often the group that sees itself as indigenous to a territory within the post-colonial states resorts to exterminatory violence against so-called foreigners and settlers in the struggle for access or control of the colonial mansion. So Mamdani describes this situation as a crisis of post-colonial citizenship, in which those defined as native or indigenous assume ownership of the state or portions thereof, thereby claiming for themselves the right to rule, depose, kill, govern, and colonize those seen as aliens. So these genocidal outcomes therefore appear to attest to a condition of closedness in some African decolonization visions, or a lack of openness to expansively redefine what Africa means and what freedom in Africa and elsewhere should mean. And this is the context informing Mbembe's decolonial visions of Afropolitanism as a critique of nativist nationalism that appear to engender xenophobia and do not offer usable prospects, political prospects for openness and accommodation of all things and all peoples. And this critique of African nativisms holds, I think, some credence in the way some contemporary African writers continue to imagine the conditions giving rise to genocidal atrocities in African context. Some notable examples will include Senegalese novelist Boubacar Boris Diop's novel, Murambi, The Book of Bones, or the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's novel, Half of a Yellow Sun, dealing with the conflict in Nigeria with the Igbo and the Nigerian states, among several other novels. So these works, I think, underscore a genocidal process based on the nativist impulse to eliminate the perceived foreign settlers, notwithstanding that the so-called settler foreigner is supposed to be a citizen and co-equal member of the post-colonial state. And a character in Diop's novel, I think, describes this condition in the context of Rwanda as an ascription of permanent guilt against the other for just being themselves. The Tutsi are barred from innocence for all eternity. Yet in Chinua Achebe's 1966 novel, A Man of the People, a story that prophetically chronicles the collapse of post-colonial Nigerian state just barely 6 years into its independence. And that chronicling is more or less a testament to the failures of the anti-colonial struggles of the mid-20th century. One of the main characters in this book provides an incisive response to this failure based on his own encounter of experiencing the luxury of being in what we might call the post-colonial house of corruption. This is what he says. He said, a man who has just come in from the rain and dried his body and put on dry clothes is more reluctant to go out again than another who has been indoors all the time. The trouble with our new nation, as I saw it then lying on that luxurious bed, was that none of us had been indoors long enough to be able to say, to hell with it. We had all been in the rain together until yesterday. Then a handful of us, the smart and the lucky and hardly ever the best, had scrambled for the one shelter our former rulers left and had taken it over and barricaded themselves in. And from within, they sought to persuade the rest through numerous loudspeakers that the next phase, the extension of our house, was even more important and called for new and original tactics. It required that all argument should cease and the whole people speak with one voice, and that any more dissent and argument outside the door of the shelter would subvert and bring down the whole house. So the passage makes clear that there's no significant changes between the colonial and the post-colonial, save for the change of occupants in the house. The colonial shelter remains intact with its doors closed. Yet, when Mbembe would proffer a vision of an open house without doors as a corrective to this condition, the challenge Achebe's narrator describes is rather on how to bring down the whole house, not lose its doors. Okay, so I want to conclude my reflection by speaking briefly about time, if only to further highlight my rejection of this decolonial vision of openness that is organized around the reformation and renovation of the colonial house. First thing I want to remark about time is a matter of simple reminder that time, as we have come to know and read it today, has been based on a colonial clock. And the colonial clock is ticking in the colonial house with doors and keys. And it's one crucial element in the plot that has not received, I think, sustained attention in the discourse on decolonization. Considering that one of the most profound attacks of colonization happened to be on time. As simple as it may sound, many colonized peoples lost the ability and the capacity to read their own time in the confrontation with colonialism. And people whose concepts and practices of time differed significantly from what we recognize today as time would understandably read history differently. And to give an example from my Igbo background, pre-colonial Igbo societies had a completely different idea and vision of time. For one thing, they had 4 days in a week, counted day and night differently, not measured in equal hours of 12, and regarded seasons and years very differently too. So it means that the understanding of age was radically different and unique. What is old and young, what is food time and rest time, when is peace or war time, and so on. These things register differently in their consideration of what is history and how to read historical changes and flows. So basically, the way they read history or register time shifts and movements would very likely differ significantly from the way we've all now been drawn into this Eurocentric colonial clock that fixes weeks and months and years as a shared universal reality, based on distilling what might be regarded as the spirit or character of an era or of an age, by which is meant generalizing and counting history and time based on the experiences and occurrences taking place in the West. And we saw an example of this recently when Western nations pressured the World Health Organization to declare that COVID-19 was a pandemic. I remember that at the time, in early March of 2020, no COVID infections had been reported in about 115 countries out of, we have, I think, 195 countries in the world. So one noticed that when the infections, for example, were spreading widely in parts of Asia and the Middle East, there weren't any significant debates in the Western media on whether to declare a global pandemic. The discourse on a pandemic label emerged when the infections began spreading in Europe and North America. And the world apparently runs by the Western clock. So a pandemic was declared and the whole world shut down. So the struggle isn't exactly about a future that is open and guaranteed, as Mbembe would want us to see it. It's also about recovering an epistemic autonomy that can lead to a present that rejects the continuing colonial conditions upon which African societies have been plunged. A decolonizing politics that is very attentive to the ways that the logic of openness and globalization has been used by Western and Eastern colonial forces to lay siege on African land and resources, a condition that continues to force millions of Africans, rich or poor, to leave the continent in droves. Mbembe's framework isn't usable politically, at least for addressing the colonial conditions of the present, including for considering how to attain what the South African scholar Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni has called epistemic freedom. That is to disentangle colonized peoples from the ideological parameters, including the concept of time, enforced by the West as the only viable and available vocabularies of meaning. Thank you for your time.
Arthur, thank you for that interesting discussion. Thank you. Do we have any questions for Arthur? We have like 5 or 10 minutes to inquire. Please. Carolyn can unmute you, or Timothy can unmute you, and we can have a brief question period.
Either let us know through the chat or by raising your virtual hand if you have a question.
Arthur, it seems like everyone's a little bit tight just now. Let me loosen things up a bit. So do you think we should burn the house down?
Well, that would be my first impulse. Yes, pull down the house. But I also understand the different implications of that for thinking about so many other kinds of things. And I, again, the quote from Achebe's novel reminds one that a lot of things had passed and that some of us are beneficiaries within this house in different ways. It's like the university and asking how we can decolonize the university. So a professor within the university is saying, yeah, we should pull down the university. What does that mean for thinking about that decolonizing project, right? So while I think that actually is a stronger political message of decolonization, I don't know exactly the repercussions and consequences of that. And in the African context, definitely yes, because I think I just don't see an alternative that wouldn't repeat the kinds of cycles of the conditions of the colonial mansion that we have. And especially coming from a Nigerian context, it looks like the kind of viable revolutionary project that should be done. And I understand when someone says, but that sounds like you are preaching violence. But that is not paying attention to the fact that the very structure we have presently is very violent and doing enormous violence to many peoples. And that asking to pull it down isn't actually doing violence, but challenging it, normalized forms of violence. Yes, so yes, pulling it down is going to be my first impulse as a person. But then as a scholar, I'm a bit reluctant, and I stand on the grounds of critique of those who are proffering solutions such as Mbembe is doing for reforming this mansion and at least removing its doors. I just don't see how that corrects or changes anything.
Right. Yeah, thank you. You know, some of these processes are natural processes of deconstruction. And I remember Jos and Elizabeth's friend of mine, mutual friend, Charles Escher, who, when he became the director of the Malmo Kunsthalle, his initial impulse, you know, in the year 2000 was precisely to burn it down, right? And an early moment in Western Europe of rethinking the institution from the ground up. But those discourses in the world of contemporary art have come quite far since then. I mean, and you know, I guess his impulse was an early kind of surfacing of that. It's hard to separate out these natural processes of deconstruction, which you're talking about pulling down, and then also intended ones. Where any thoughts on that?
Yes, I like what I'm suggesting in terms of pulling down these structures. They're actually not new. In the 60s and 70s, some Nigerian writers actually grappled with that. And I think one of the most profound metaphors used to describe the condition of this deconstruction was proffered by the Nigerian writer Wole Soyinka, who, again, it sounded like a revision of the myth of Sisyphus, but it's actually a Yoruba mythology of the creation of Yoruba gods. There was, in that mythology, there was this human servant punished to roll up a boulder endlessly up the hill by this god with massive head. So one day he rolls the boulder up the hill and looks down and realizes that the god is asleep, and he decides to end the suffering by throwing the stone on the god's head and smashes the god. But rather than ending the problem, there came out fragments from the Godhead, and each fragment became a God with a unique personality, multiplying the conditions of his problems. And that was actually the origin story of how gods were created in the Yoruba cosmology, right? So I understand that and the implications of that deconstructive thing. And I think Soyinka used it to explain the process of the kind of things that could happen when we try to deconstruct. We end up multiplying conditions. But I understand that the condition, at least historically, when multiplied, splinters and create contentions that could actually offer some prospect for thinking about freedom, as against organized under one single. I mean, there are different iterations of it, but I found that metaphor very interesting in the Nigerian context for the kinds of arguments people made that if we pull down this colonial house that shapes reality now, we end up with multiple problems but it looks like a necessary kind of fragment to have. Now we begin different kinds of processes of contentions. And again, that sounds democratic to me than the totalitarianism suggested in one Godhead, determining and forcing things, right? So I still think, as much as we understand the paradox of that deconstructive process, perhaps, smashing the Godhead might offer more possibilities.
I think Melanie Braith has a question for you, Arthur.
I do. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was so interesting and amazing. I do have a question about the colonial clock that you talked to toward the end of your presentation, because I'd really like to hear more about, and I'm wondering, are you aware of anything that people do to disrupt the colonial clock? And specifically, I think literature might be a tool to disrupt the colonial clock and narrative strategies in relation to time, bringing back the clocks that were in place before the colonial clock. I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit more about that.
And thanks for that question. Again, I don't know if I know in philosophy and in some aspects of cultural studies, people have raised questions about the way we read history, and particularly the fixing of African history along the three periods of pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial that all center the colonial, right? So the colonial, again, and that way of thinking about African history, or say colonized people's histories anyway, seems to make the case that European colonizers were the enablers of history. You know, history happened only when they came, and outside of their presence, there was no history. So we have to understand that pre-colonial is this prehistorical, and then the moment of history and what came after and all that, right? So that problem had remained firmly there. In many of the contemporary literary works, I think I haven't seen so much in terms of a challenge of that timing. And perhaps that's the reason that someone like the Congolese historian felt that we haven't started doing proper African history in African context, apart from the kinds of works the Africanists, people like Sheikh Anta Diop did in the 70s and so on, that tried to recover some aspects of pre-colonial African histories away from European events. So the idea is to take a novel like Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, considered as one of the canonical African novels or modern African novels. The suggestion of things falling apart in the title of the work, which is a critique by this Congolese historian, suggests that things started falling apart when colonizers came. And that's the moment in which we have to understand this collapse and so on. Whereas actually things had been falling apart long before then, even long before the Atlantic slave trades and so on. There are a few novels that probably offer that way of rethinking time, but I'm struggling to find clear visions of a decolonized time in these literatures that, for example, help to recover the way Igbo people read time and what that meant, and how they read time radically alters the way we look at reality, the way we think about different other aspects of who we are and what it means to be in the world at this time, right? Yeah, but I mean, that's the challenge for me.
Thank you, Arthur. Melanie, I noticed there's a few other hands up, but perhaps those of you could wait, and perhaps we could return to those questions after a few more of the presenters have gone. Then we'll all be fresh. And thank you, Arthur. Let me introduce Dr. Melanie Braith. Melanie Braith is project manager of the 6 seasons of the Aniskau-Ithinawak Partnership Project and the research coordinator for the Center for Research in Young People's Texts and Cultures at the University of Winnipeg. Her research focuses on traditional Indigenous storytelling and its contemporary manifestations and reinventions. Melanie is a settler scholar from Germany who lives and works in Winnipeg. The title of her lecture is Learning from the 6 Seasons, Research with the Aniskau-Ithinawak. Please welcome Melanie Braith.
Thank you so much. And could I also get the possibility to share my screen? Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Chef, for having us all here. Thank you, Carolyn and Timothy, for the amazing organization of this event. I'm really honored to be here today and to share a little bit about the research that I'm doing. And I think my lecture or presentation, I think it will resonate quite well with a few things that Arthur raised in his presentation as well. And since the topic of the speaker series is relative time, little time, so what I want to speak about is in times in plural. There are several times, and I want to speak about those times in relation to each other. So let me just share my screen with my presentation. And I hope you can see this. Okay, so yes, as you just heard, I am a settler scholar from Germany, and I've been living and working in Canada for the past 5 years. I came to Winnipeg for my PhD at the University of Manitoba, and I was focusing on Indigenous literatures and specifically Cree and Anishinaabe storytelling in relation to residential school narratives. And it is important for me to situate myself as a non-Indigenous scholar, specifically a German scholar, when I speak about my research in Indigenous storytelling, but also my work with knowledge keepers from Rocky Cree communities in northern Manitoba. Aniskau-Ithinawak is actually the Cree term for Rocky Cree. And so in my presentation, I want to speak a little bit about my learning processes that has come up in my research. And so for the past few years, I've been lucky to be involved in a shared partnership project, 6 seasons of the Aniskau-Ithinawak, that is housed at the University of Winnipeg. I've been a research assistant when I was a PhD student. I was a postdoc on the project, and at the moment, I'm in a more long-term position as project manager and researcher. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity because it gives me a chance to work together with Indigenous communities as a non-Indigenous scholar and to establish relationships when working together. At the heart of our project is a Rocky Cree storyteller, William Dumas, and really his stories and his work is at the very heart of the project. And you can see that there are quite a few people working together on this project. Project director is Dr. Mavis Reimer at the University of Winnipeg. And then there are project co-applicants and collaborators, research associates and students all over Canada that are involved. Specifically, we're working with several community partners as well that you can see here on the slide. And I do want to highlight our work with Opipinapewen Cree Nation, so that's South Indian Lake in northern Manitoba, and Nisitchewayasik Cree Nation, that's Nelson House in northern Manitoba. And the main objective of the project is to support the ongoing work of reclaiming Indigenous languages, histories, and knowledges among the Aniskau-Ithinawak, among the Rocky Cree. And our work takes on quite concrete forms. At the heart of the project is the creation of a cycle of 6 historical picture books that teach about Aniskau-Ithinawak history and culture. And these books are organized according to the 6 seasons of the Aniskau-Ithinawak, therefore, hence the title of the project. And there's one book for each of the 6 seasons. So there's supposed to be one book as we're working on creating them. And each of the books is set in one particular season. There's also, we're planning to create apps, picture books apps to go with each of the books. And the amazing thing about a picture book app is that the user can actually listen to the text in Cree, and they can even read the text in Cree syllabics. And then the goal is also to produce teacher's guides for each of the books with curriculum suggestions for middle grade school teachers. Now, my objective for my talk today is twofold. I would like to reflect on the workings of time in the picture books of our series, and I would like to speak about time in relation to the work that we do on the 6 Seasons project itself from my perspective as project manager. And the idea behind this is that I would like to look at how different conceptualizations of time meet at the 6 Seasons project, settler time and Rocky Cree time, and I will show how these relate to each other in our work. I found settler scholar Mark Rifkin's book, Beyond Settler Time, Temporal Sovereignty and Indigenous Self-Determination to be a helpful theoretical framework for this discussion. And in the introduction, Rifkin makes the following observation, quote, "Native peoples occupy a double bind within dominant settler reckonings of time. Either they are consigned to the past or they are inserted into a present defined on non-native terms. From this perspective, Native peoples do not so much exist within the flow of time as erupt from it as an anomaly, one usually understood as emanating from a bygone era," end of quote. I do want to, for a little bit, I want to stay with the first part of the statement that Indigenous people are consigned to the past in settler reckonings of time. Rifkin's statement is, in my opinion, a very justified criticism of colonial discourses of the past decades, and some of them are still ongoing today. Now, I do briefly want to put our own project in relation to this criticism because, as I mentioned before, the 6 Seasons project is working on creating historical picture books about Rocky Cree life, and actually in the proto-contact period in the 1600s. Proto-contact period referring to that time period when the Rocky Cree would have heard stories about newcomers arriving through trade works from other people, but they would not have met those newcomers themselves yet. So that's the proto-contact period we're looking at in the picture books. So clearly our project is very interested in teaching about Indigenous people in the past. However, it is of course not the objective of our books to consign Indigenous people to the past, quite the opposite. The need to create these books has been identified by the communities because they want their children to be taught about how Rocky Cree used to live, so that with this knowledge, they can move forward into the future. The Rocky Cree communities we work with wanted to have these books because there were few appropriate resources for curriculums in schools, and because of residential schooling, the knowledge transfer within Indigenous communities themselves has been disrupted to a certain extent. Therefore, in the case of 6 Seasons, what we are trying to do is supporting an act of cultural resurgence. The 6 Seasons books strive toward historical accuracy, and the characters are fictional, but their environment, their practices, their lifestyle are depicted as historically accurately as we can. And so they're based on the oral tradition and information that knowledge keepers have kept alive. It's based on archaeological research and historical research. And really the picture books are geared toward disseminating cultural knowledge and supporting resurgence after the deep impact of residential schools. The series emphasizes the presence of Rocky Cree culture in the present. So one example in our forthcoming second book, forthcoming in September, we tell the story of Amo, who is a Rocky Cree girl in the 1600s who decides that her purpose in life is to become a pottery maker, and she makes beautiful pots. And at the very end, our picture book, the last page, moves into the present and shows contemporary Rocky Cree people who found pottery sherds of their ancestors on their land. So it is really about emphasizing the present as much as the past. Our book series is organized around the Rocky Creek calendar that is based on 13 moons and 6 seasons. And here you can already see a difference to the Gregorian calendar based on 12 months and Western culture that usually speaks of 4 seasons, or settler time and the colonial clock that Arthur mentioned earlier in his presentation. The Rocky Creek seasons include Methoscamine, which is spring, Nipin, which is summer, Tagwagan, which is fall, Mikaskau, which is freeze up, Pipon, which is winter, and then Sikwan, which is break up. And so the 2 additional seasons, freeze up and break up, they really very much refer to the waterways that the Rocky Creek used for traveling underwater and for trade. And so the calendar exists in very close relation to Rocky Creek interactions with the land. And this fact is reflected in the 6 Seasons book series. So each of the books is set in one of the seasons and describes the Rocky Creek people's interactions with the land that would happen in this particular season. This is an example from Peace Finds Her Miskenau. The revised version came out in 2020. Miskenau refers to a purpose in one's life. So Peace finds her purpose in her life. And early in the book, Peace and her family, for example, are described as gathering eggs for the camp and for the spring gathering. Here you can see them actually moving in canoes on the water. And then on the right side, you can see archaeological information, linguistic information, and you can also see a map of the place where the story is set. So I want to think a bit more about place and time. And if you are familiar with Indigenous literary studies, you will definitely be familiar with the following quotation from Lakota scholar Wayne Deloria Jr.'s book, God is Red. There he says, American Indians hold their lands, places, as having the highest possible meaning, and all their statements are made with this reference point in mind. Immigrants review the movement of their ancestors across the continent as a steady progression of basically good events and experiences, thereby placing history, time, in the best possible light. And in the past decades, this quotation has often been taken by scholars as meaning that Indigenous cultures are centered around place, whereas settler cultures in North America are more centered around time. What I'm hoping to show today is that the way I learned it in Rocky Creek culture, place and time are actually closely intertwined through the Rocky Creek's interactions with the land in particular seasons. Going back to our picture book scholar Perry Nodelman points out that stories, which are about movements and changes, necessarily take place in time, whereas most pictures depict only how things look at one moment separated from the flow of time. So basically, pictures are always frozen, whereas the point of a story is that it moves along through time. And if we then think of scholarship around images in graphic novels, Baitons and Frey argue that really the most visible medium-specific feature for graphic novels is the importance given to space. So picture books like Peace, the one you see here, really combine narratives associated with time and images associated with space, bringing them together. And in this medium, time and space become intertwined through the reader's interaction with both of them. And in a way, this process mirrors how time and place become intertwined in the characters' interactions with place through time. One of the main features of the books is that they show how much life of the Rocky Creek in the 1600s was shaped by their interactions with place through particular seasons or times. And our life today, especially in the city, is very different, and we do not experience place or the seasons in the same way as we sit in buildings that create spaces untouched by the passing of the seasons. The work of literary researchers usually happens in exactly such spaces. Our work is very much that of the mind and the imagination as we enter imaginative spaces of stories and intellectual spaces of theory, work that is also potentially untouched by the passing of the seasons. My work as a project manager and researcher with the 6 Seasons Project has been very different from everything I have been used to as a literary scholar. And that brings me to the second part of my talk today, how different notions of time meet in the work of this project. I do want to go back to Mark Rifkin's work on settler time and indigenous notions of time and another one of his claims. He said, and I quote, "I argue that asserting the shared modernity or presentness of natives and non-natives implicitly casts indigenous peoples as inhabiting the current moment and moving toward the future in ways that treat dominant non-native geographies, intellectual and political categories, periodizations, and conceptions of causality as given, as the background against which to register and assess native being in time." So to sum up Rifkin's argument, settler discourses tend to relegate indigenous people to the past, but settlers' acknowledgement of native people's presence in the present is potentially equally harmful because it assumes the present according to settler conceptualizations of time. And this is then yet another denial of indigenous sovereignty, Rifkin says. And Rifkin writes from the United States, but I would argue that his points are very valid for Canada as well, in the Canadian context. So he says that US colonialism produces its own temporal formation with its own particular ways of apprehending time. And the state's policies, mappings, and imperatives generate the frame of reference. More than just affecting ideologies or discourses of time, that network of institutionalized authority over domestic territory also powerfully shapes the possibilities for interaction, development, and regularity within it. Such imposition can be understood as a denial of indigenous temporal sovereignty, in a sense that one vision or way of experiencing time is cast as the only temporal formation, as the baseline for the unfolding of time itself. Rifkin still emphasizes that indigenous temporal orientations in part manage to resist this act of what you might want to call temporal colonialism, my words, not Rifkin's. And I have been thinking about this quotation specifically in relation to a shirk partnership project where I would say shirk regulations also provide a certain framework according to which research happens. We have timelines, we have deadlines, progress reports, milestones, interactions within spaces of research institutions. And specifically as a project manager, I am well familiar with this framework, and it is part of my position to help moving the project forward in relation to this framework. At the same time, however, there's the Rocky Cree framework of the 6 seasons that is so central to our project. And there's often a need to slow down and let relationships establish at their own pace. And there is a need for research that happens in close relation to the seasons and place, as it is reflected in the books and as I've spoken about earlier. At the 6 Seasons Project, we disrupt settler frames of reference in many ways to make room for Rocky Cree notions of time and place. Rifkin, for example, suggests that, quote, "Rather than approaching time as an abstract, homogeneous measure of universal movement along a singular axis, we can think of it as plural, less as a temporality than temporalities. From this perspective, there is no singular unfolding of time, but instead varied temporal formations that have their own rhythms, patterns of consistency and transformation that emerge imminently out of the multifaceted and shifting sets of relationship that constitute those formations and out of the interactions among those formations." So I think that this plurality of temporalities is reflected in our work at the 6 Seasons Project, and we try to create an awareness of the Rocky Cree 6 Seasons temporality. A very simple example for this is that we organized our newsletter not around months, but actually around the Rocky Cree moons. And in every newsletter, we start out by explaining what a certain moon is about and what the related actions on the land would be, for example. And that is project storyteller and mentor William Dumas really in the beginning of the newsletter speaks about the moon. And I'm just going to quote from one of our newsletters last year in summer when it was time for Pascoe Pisum, which is the molting moon. And as William told us, we were still in the season of Nipin, summer, and the moon that we were in was Pascoe Pisum, the molting moon. And this is a time when the waterfowl and the eagles are molting. when they're getting new feathers. During this moon, young birds are testing their wings so that they can fly south in the fall. So really, our newsletter tries to gesture toward interactions with place through time, and it serves as a reminder of the Rocky Tree 6 seasons temporality. And I would also argue that in our research work on the 6 Seasons project, the work is very much determined by Rocky Tree notions of time that emerge from interactions with place through time. For example, last year in late summer, I had a chance to help with the research for our next book in the series, book 3, which is set in fall. And it is all about picking medicines and gathering food for the upcoming winter. And our research happened out on the land and water at Suwannee Lake, which is a bit northwest of Nelson House. And that is also the setting of the book. And so our research had to happen at a time when the right medicines would be growing. And our time of the lake was then influenced by 2 forest fires that were close by in the area. So we didn't have much time on the lake because the forest fires were there also. And in book 3 of that series, the characters, they will be picking weegus, among other things. Weegus is a root that grows underwater, and on the top right, you can see myself trying to pick the root that's growing underwater. And knowledge keeper Leslie Baker at the top right, bottom right of the slide, he showed us how you can find the root underwater and how you can get it out. And there he is busy cleaning it off different smaller roots that were still growing on it. And then I was also learning from our project storyteller, William Dumas, who you can see at the bottom left corner. And he was showing me how to tie up the roots so that you can hang them up to dry, which is very important for medicine to do right away. And this is only one example of how our research is carried out in relation to the Rocky Tree seasons, and how this temporality is as important for our work as our settler temporalities of timelines and grand progress reports. And I've been thinking about how COVID has slowed down settler temporality, and how many of our deadlines have changed and milestones have been moved. And our research was certainly affected, especially when it comes to travel to the communities. Interestingly, though, the interactions with the land, according to the seasons, have not been changed so much by COVID. Medicine picking and hunting was still happening in fall, and then stories would still be told in winter. There is, however, another factor that has been affecting the 6 seasons temporality, and that is climate change. And I've been mentioning the forest fires before. Actually, last year, there were several instances where travel between Winnipeg and Thompson and Nelson House was slowed down or prevented because there were too many forest fires in the area. And also our interactions with the land when we were at Suwannee Lake, they did occur at the right time, but the water level at Suwannee was much higher than it usually is. And some of the common places for picking medicines were actually underwater, also a sign related to climate change. And so to conclude, I think from my own perspective as project manager and researcher on the 6 Seasons project, both settler temporality and Rocky Tree temporality need to be taken into consideration as they shape our work to tell the stories. And ironically, our stories eventually transcend both time and place of their origin. And that is all what I wanted to talk to you about. I have some links and where you can find the picture books and the app and the teacher's guide. The app and the teacher's guide are available for free online, and also some works cited that I used in the presentation.
Thank you, Melanie. Wonderful. Yes, definitely. Carolyn, again, can unmute you if you have questions for Melanie, and please indicate with a raised hand. Maybe I'll ask a question to get the ideas flowing again, Melanie. When it comes to sixth season project, as you were suggesting it, I mean, here in Winnipeg, it's like the freeze up and the breakup are being contracted so enormously by climate change. Do you think there's a collapse happening from the sixth season to the fourth season?
I don't know if it is a collapse. I haven't been in Winnipeg long enough to make a statement about that. But actually, I have been listening to knowledge keepers speaking about how the 6 seasons up north have also been somewhat changing. And when we are speaking about the moon every month, William is often saying, yeah, things are a little bit different at the moment. Like, it doesn't really correspond, what happens on the land doesn't exactly correspond anymore to the moon as much as it used to. And they were also thinking about climate change in relation to that. So I think there's definitely visible changes happening and are being observed.
Are there stories about the freeze up and the breakup that give any indication of the kind of time span that those events would have occurred in?
Oh, I'm pretty sure there are, yes, and also in relation to the moons. And I mean, our picture books are also related to, we would say, our one picture book happens during freeze up, and then we would name the certain moons that are associated with it. So there's definitely quite a defined time span there. And that is one of the idea of the books, is to teach children today how, like, when the time span was supposed to be, right?
Thank you. Warren Carew has a question.
Hi, Melanie. I'm just joining in as a member of the 6 Seasons team, and I want to thank you for such a fascinating discussion of the work that we've been taking for the last 4.5 years or so now. One thing that I find really interesting in relation to what you were talking about with temporality of stories is, I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit more on I guess the oral story beginnings of these books that we work on. So William tells the stories, and we make recordings, and sometimes we'll have the stories retold. And I guess, to me, oral stories have a different kind of temporality from texts and from images. So I'm wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit about that as well.
I do have my book here. Since you're mentioning the opening of our books usually start with Kayas Nisosima Kayas. A long time ago, my grandchildren, I think is it a long time ago? So there is this term that's called Kayas in pre-stories that refers to a long time ago. And when Warren talks about how the temporalities sometimes were different in oral stories, I think there is a whole genre of oral stories that William, our storyteller on the project, refers to as the mist of time stories that happen to a temporality that is quite different from our settled time and is not really, it's kind of like before human time, but without that specified very Western timeline that you could locate it somewhere. So it is, he really refers to it as the mist of time, which is a very interesting way of having history without having it part of the Western timeline so much. I think, is that something that you were referring to, Warren?
Yeah, that's fascinating to me, and I think just the idea of how the story is told in a transient moment, right? And it's not preserved for the future, except in the memories of the listeners, and then in the retellings. And so I think that's interesting as an alternate form of moving the story into the future as well.
Yes, yeah, I should say that William usually tells the story. He works on it in his head, and he writes the story in his head, and then tells them to us at specific points in time. Then which is very, very uncommon for us with our linear ways of writing. That where we put things down, yes. Mhm. Thank you, Warren. Yeah, I should say Warren Carreau is a story team member at the Six Seasons Project, and he's working with William on creating the story text for the books.
Could I follow up that question? I'm trying to imagine how a community member would listen and respond to the misty time that you described, which is, you know, not settler time. Can we understand that as in terms of the kind of fictional engagement with literature that we ourselves would imaginatively project into, for instance, or is it a different notion of time, even in terms of imaginative engagement?
In a way, I want to say yes, in terms of that we can imagine ourselves into it, but basically, when it comes to the word fiction itself, I'm always a bit hesitant because one of the definitions of fiction is that it is made up. Mm-hmm. And Mist of Time stories are really for Rocky Cree or Indigenous people. These stories are, well, true things that happened in the midst of time, right? And so I wouldn't want to call them fiction. It's also why, for example, William Dumas on our project, sometimes they're called legends, the legend of this or that, and William really wouldn't like us to call them legends because it too much evokes the idea of that it is somehow this is not a true happening that is recorded there. And so even this Mist of Time stories, sometimes there's non-human characters in there, but still they are part of the oral history.
So even so, I guess in that sense, like an ethical encounter still can't be staged by any kind of imaginative engagement. There's still a distance. Round into it. One more question for Melanie. Perhaps we can return to you, Melanie, at the end of our little roundtable here. Thank you very much. I'll introduce our next speaker, Singh Matharoo. Singh Matharoo is a postdoctoral fellow of French in the Department of Romance Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His current book project is provisionally titled Race and the Apocalypse: Toward a Solar Semiotics of Energy. He has published essays in Horror Studies, Green Letters, Alienocene, and in a new anthology on Philip K. Dick. His essay there is titled Ubik Does Not Yet Exist, Reading Philip K. Dick's Ubik as a Case of Extro Science Fiction. That was interesting. He's a practicing noise musician, and the title of his lecture is An Artificial Anthropology of Noise. Please welcome Singh Matharoo.
Hello, I hope each of you is well, and thank you for being here today. I also want to specifically thank Chip, Timothy, my co-roundtable participants, Mosaic, and Bic Vanderpool for their generous support. I want to share a screenshot of my current research project in the form of a paper I've retitled, Translating the Energy of Wonder in Language Toward an Artificial Ecology of Noise. This is an exploratory work insofar as I'm trying to understand some concepts by taking recourse to a variety of disciplines outside of my home base of comparative literature, and in particular French and Francophone studies. I welcome any questions or comments you might share in the Q&A, as I've consistently found that more feedback nets more interesting work. Before jumping in, I think it would be helpful to explain how this talk fits into my larger research project, responding to the Anthropocenic energy crisis and the need to transition to alternate energy sources. I argue that wonder may contribute to a transformation of petroculture, which limits our linguistic imagination to oil. Such a limitation reflects the ravenous exploitation of what Andreas Malm calls fossil capital, or a triangulation of capital, labor, and extra-human nature. This exploitation is isomorphic with the colonial racial violence that structures the non-white, non-European, quote-unquote irrational, and ultimately non-straight, non-normatively abled, non-male, non-human as the easy, limitless resource of its opposite, the anthropos of the Anthropocene. This violent commodification of energy precludes the development of expenditures of energy outside the capitalist economy of use and exchange, accumulation, consumerism, and so on. In the energy humanities, the study of aesthetics has been sidelined because it lacks use value. My research addresses this lapse by considering how the aesthetics of French and English language speculative and post-apocalyptic literature and philosophy gift us an energy resistant to easy use via the activation of wonder. My research suggests that wonder isn't bound to anthropos as a kind of structural ontology, but cuts across matter, organic and inorganic. It's the deconstruction of the presupposition that non-humans are irrational or non-sapient. From a subaltern position, that is, I speculate that the apocalypse has already happened and that we might endure its disorienting effects by sifting through its ruins for energy. Time, in other words, has already run out. There is no new, no normal. Yet, I want to suggest that wonder authorizes us to approach the energy crisis not from the perspective of the world as it is in dread of extinction, but from an alternate possible world where the apocalyptic future has already come to pass and is approached with openness. Such a departure from alarmism has impelled me to adopt a writing style that functions according to a queer logic of rational systematization by way of quantum leaps or sudden bursts of energy that perform the pleasurable and painful search for energy outside the capitalist economy and towards something more like a left accelerationist gift economy. Important to my research is my theorization of a materialist semiotics indebted to the idiosyncratic work of 20th century French writer Georges Bataille, whose recognition of the infinite generosity of the sun authorizes delirious, critical, excessive, and corporeally and affectively intense reading practices and contingent writing practices that free language via wonder, gesturing to solar-powered futures beyond the apocalyptic present and the binary categories that needlessly structure it. Here, I'm indebted to Derrida and his deconstructionist followers whose breakings of Saussurean binary semiotics informs my attempts to think contingency, which specifically comes from my engagement with Althusser and Quentin Meillassoux. My argument is that such theoretical practices perform the sense of wonder constitutive of a form of speculative fiction whose conditions are to be found perhaps surprisingly in Descartes. Which brings me back to what I would like to ask today, namely, how do artists, in my research, poets, authors, writers, and philosophers working in a speculative register, translate the extra-human nature, energy of wonder in language? In moving toward an answer, I want to first clarify what I mean by energy and wonder before clarifying how they relate to one another in the context of post-apocalyptic literature. And I should also say this is a little bit of it's an exploratory paper, as I said earlier, but it's also a bit of a challenge for me because my bread and butter tends to be literary studies and specifically close reading. So this is kind of a break from that. So please bear with me. First, energy. As Fabio Bevilacqua asks in the introduction to a 2014 special issue of Science and Education on energy, today, energy is one of the most widespread terms in popular and scientific use. Both enthusiasts and opponents of contemporary Western civilization recognize its foundational role. Eastern philosophies of nature have terms that are related to it. Energy issues dominate social, political, technological, military discussions and events. However, it's not at all clear if its various meanings are acceptable aspects of its polysemic nature or the result of deep confusion. Is there a way to clarify the field? Bevilacqua turns to history for clarification, returning us to pre-Socratic atomism, which may be understood as a materialist philosophy of becoming through aggregations and separations of underlying stable elements. However, complicating matters is the recent theory of dark energy, which it has been argued is driving the accelerated expansion of the universe. According to the 2011 Nobel Prize organization, dark energy is placed in empty space, which according to quantum physics is actually never completely empty. Instead, the vacuum is supposed to be a bubbling quantum soup where virtual particles of matter and antimatter pop in and out of existence and give rise to energy. However, the simplest estimation for the amount of dark energy doesn't correspond at all to the amount that has been measured in space, which is about 10 to the 120th times larger. This passage reads like an explosion of the Lucretian clinamen, or the unpredictable swerve of atoms in void that results in unexpected encounters between atoms, thereby generating new systems. At the same time, it reads like an affirmation of what Derrida calls writing's aphoristic energy, or writing's difference-generating resistance to the book understood as a natural totality. In other words, it reads like contingency. And as literary historian Stephen Greenblatt writes, there is no escape from contingency. In any event, as a consequence of the emergence of dark energy, cosmologists and elementary particle physicists are today debating the validity of the principle of conservation of energy, asking, can, after all, there be such a thing as new energy? Is energy a vivid or graphic description, as Aristotle might describe it in terms of rhetoric, or is it a potential for becoming? Is energy the constant recirculation of matter, or can energy be created or destroyed? Or following Michael Martyr, is energy perhaps, quote, a subject who dreams while the object it dreams about is actuality, end quote. Things get extremely confusing when we center the question of Anthropocenic energy crisis. Amidst all this confusion, I suggest we take a step back and provisionally think of energy as the recognition of contingency, that anything can change, to follow Meillassoux speculative materialist philosophy. I want to think of text and reader as separate entities. I want to think about reading playfully as a contingent kind of energetics that activates wonder. Although a comprehensive detour to the 18th century is impossible here, I'm not even sure if I'll be able to do this in the project, I want to say that my understanding of matter is closer to Diderot's theorization of it as the mobile possibility condition of the heterogeneity or qualitative differentiation of matter. In this way, it's close to Natanya Meeker's delineation of literary materialism, which is revealed, quote, in each reader's physiological responsiveness to poetic forms, end quote. I'm specifically interested in the response of wonder. And so Descartes' philosophy is generative here. Again, this isn't the place to tease out Descartes from Cartesianism, but I think it's important to say that I'm drawing specifically from James Griffith's 2018 innovative book, Fable, Method, and Imagination in Descartes, which offers us a way of rethinking the Cartesian dualism of mind-matter within Descartes' own mobilization and perhaps forgetting of the fable structure across his oeuvre, whereby the principal mark of rationality becomes the capacity to wonder at contingency. For my purposes, I find particularly compelling Griffith's analysis of wonder in Descartes. Griffith summarizes the accepted reading of Descartes' faculty psychology as the mind is divided into the faculties of intellect, will, passion, sensation, memory, and imagination. The intellect perceives ideas and, combined with the will, determines whether said ideas are clearly and distinctly perceived. The will is an infinitely free faculty, the volitions of which are limited by intellectual perception and the body. The passions are reactions to experiences in the world. Sensation is the faculty to experience the world. Finally, memory and the imagination are the faculties that store and recombine ideas, volitions, passions, and sensations. Yet Griffith compellingly shows that for Descartes, the fabulation of the world precedes and further conditions this entire psychology, at once upending given understandings of mind and matter and throwing into question the idea that reason is a distinctly human practice. At bottom, in Griffith's Descartes, is the imagination's capacity for hyperbolic doubt, which, quote, imagines the imaginable in imagining the unimaginable. In Griffith's argument, the imagination is transfinite insofar as it can freely move between the infinite will, whose volitions are limited by perception in the body, the latter of which is impelled by the very subtle wind of animal spirits, and the finite passion of wonder, which is the occurrence of surprise at a novel object that just shouldn't be. Importantly, with wonder, the object encountered has no utility, and so, like desire, has no opposite or corollary. and in telling fables about the quote, wondrousness of the objects of a world that is other than how it presents itself, end quote, the world itself is rendered wondrous. As Griffith neatly summarizes, to doubt, one must imagine, and this doubt leads to the rational conclusion that the imagination is limited, but it does so through hyperbolicity, by which the imagination throws the mind beyond itself, beyond the images it remembers and remembers as unexpected, beyond the world and its rules, such that the world can be reimagined, fabulated anew, given a new story, as rule obedient according to rules generated in the telling of a story, a fiction, a work of imagination, end quote. Wonder then, while not being useful per se, can serve a pedagogical function in making us learn and retain in our memory things of which we were previously ignorant, although Descartes himself would probably ignore this aspect of his own thinking. Louise Economides puts this another way, quote, maintaining a capacity to celebrate the world's wondrous contingency is the task of a lifetime and an ongoing challenge for art in an age of ecological risk, end quote. In what will eventually, I hope, be a book manuscript, I'll build on Economides' work disentangling wonder from the sublime by disentangling wonder from horror vis-a-vis Baudelaire's Poetics of Noise, not to mention several other things that I'd be happy to address in terms of the organization in the Q&A, which I'll briefly discuss or introduce now before concluding with some comments about where I see this all going. Baudelaire was a French poet, critic, and translator whose work signaled the shift from a romanticism to symbolism and represent a definitive example of the decadent movement, thus paving the way for the crystallization of surrealism in the 20th century. Baudelaire's myriad stylistic and conceptual innovations were designed to create a flux of verse that could extract from the abyss of modern experience a vision of reality appropriate to the volatility and uncertainty of modern life, of the messiness of lived experiences. 20th century horror literature, particularly in its weird and cosmic registers, owes a great deal to Baudelaire, whose hallucinatory and erotic meditations on possession, corpses, vampires, nightmares, ghosts, poison, pain, and death conjure overwhelming sensations of wonder while turning inside out traditional notions of space and time. Indeed, years before Lovecraft would define the weird and supernatural horror in literature, Baudelaire remarked, "The beautiful is always strange." Inspired by the Gothic writings of Poe, Baudelaire published in 1857 The Flowers of Evil, an immeasurably influential volume comprised of breathless poems dedicated to poet Théophile Gautier, and later praised by such writers as Duchamp, Flaubert, and Hugo. These metaphysically pessimistic works problematize the romantic view of a harmonious relationship between inner and outer worlds, or words perhaps, in favor of an embrace of vertiginous multiplicity, of an ironic fall from grace and a satanic rupture in the spleen of fear and flight. The ecstatic and funerary poems, including under the headings Révolte and La Mort, best exemplify the volume's anticipation of and role in shaping the genre of cosmic horror. Of particular interest to me is Baudelaire's Poetics of Noise, which I argue activates wonder and thus gives us energy in forcing us to recognize contingency. I don't necessarily want to think about Baudelaire's poetics in the context of literary movement or genre, but in terms of its investment in a decidedly Neo-Lucretian way of thinking about form, matter, and mind. Important to this investment is the 12-syllable alexandrine, the dominant meter in French versification. The regular alexandrine can be described as a 12-syllable line with a caesura after the 6th syllable and accents at the 6th and 12th syllables. As deciphered by Rachel Killick in the 1861 edition of The Flowers of Evil, 89 of the 127 poems are in alexandrines. Moreover, as deciphered by James R. Lawler, the book's architecture consists in a repeated pattern of groups of poems in 5s and 3s that emphasize a dialectic that constantly throws the self into question, into what Paul de Man describes as, quote, the ironic mind in an endless process that leads to no synthesis, end quote. In other words, Baudelaire's poetics is shaped by the rhythms of traditional versification, but as Killick argues, quote, responsive less to rules, like perhaps Descartes would insist on, thereby ignoring the passion specifically of wonder for fear of its kind of I guess, acceleration to astonishment, which he seems really reluctant to lean into. So it's responsive less to rules than to the fundamental principles they embody, including crucially the need for freedom and surprise, end quote. Baudelaire, in other words, takes a traditional dominant form and rescues from it the principles of freedom and surprise by transgressing the reader's expectations of what counts as good. Unsurprisingly, 6 poems from the Flowers of Evil were condemned and suppressed on grounds of moral indecency. I want to suggest that this particular method of remixing emphasizes the uselessness of noise. Again, use doesn't necessarily mean for me the absence of any pedagogical function, as we saw with Descartes' sense of wonder. It's more about retaining in our memory things of which we were previously ignorant for future recombination. On noise, Denise Ferrer de Silva's excavation of the racial regime of modern representation is generative. She writes, "Moved by the questioning of interiority, the racial cannot but impose on modern representation. I learned that the madman and the poet are the limits of modern representation only because they constitute the 2 faces of self-consciousness. Never oblivious to the logos, if it is taken to signify a given order, rule, or disposition, connection, or wording of things, the mind that misrepresents, the one that fails to communicate the proper meanings, still assumes that correspondence between words and things that defines representation. Rather than being without reason and word, the madman represents according to other rules of signification. Nor does the poet, the mind who attempts to unearth hidden similitude, move beyond the boundaries of modern representation." And this is the line that I'm very, very interested in. "Otherwise, the meanings the poet produces would vanish as noise, as a loss, and not as an addition to signification." End quote. So I'm wondering if there are meanings produced by artists that do vanish as noise, as loss, and not as an addition to signification. How, in other words, might we transgress the limits of the madman and the poet today, and thus the limits of colonial racial capitalism? With Baudelaire's poetics as a jumping off point, informed by a variety of thinkers I've discussed today, I want to suggest that the generation of noise, of that which doesn't belong to a given form according to the rules that govern it, inaugurates wonder at contingency, that even forms seemingly locked into place, into space and time, perhaps the university, can change. I like the capaciousness of this definition because it promises to sidestep questions of literary movement and genre. It seems to also allow for both reform and revolution, although I admit this is an open question. In any event, I found some examples of post-apocalyptic works that I think accomplish this through a variety of effects, including British science fiction author J.G. Ballard's climate fiction trilogy, French artists Jacques Loeb, Jean-Marc Rochette, and Benjamin Legrand's science fiction graphic novel Le Transpersonnage, Algerian anti-colonial author Mohamed Deeb's speculative fiction novel Qui se souvient de la mer, African-American gay author Samuel R. Delaney's science fiction novel Dahlgren, and Lebanese-American lesbian painter, poet, and philosopher Attila Adnan's post-apocalyptic book of poems, L'Apocalypse Arabe, and her English rewrite of it, The Arab Apocalypse. But I don't think this mode of détournement or rerouting is limited to literature. I can see this type of labor at work in a variety of other media, including painting, film, television, music, and video games. And I'd be happy to learn of any examples you might share in the Q&A as well. I'd now like to offer some concluding remarks that underline, I hope, the relevance of this project. In an era marked by crisis, I think the arts can help us by way of wonder to remember that anything can change. In this way, the arts have always been artificial if we follow Reza Negarestani and understand artificiality to be, quote, adaptation to new purposes or ends, the crafting of something using recipes for action for an end that is not given in advance in the material ingredients, end quote. Nature then would be absolutely purposeless. It would be closer to how Frédéric Nérat, following Rousseau, describes it, quote, not as substance or transcendental principle, but as the detour, the mediation, the transient outside, which permits us to engage in a radical critique of society and to call for its political transformation, end quote. Hyperbolic doubt, the imagination, to remember the previously unexpected, to wonder, to unearth language again and again. I want to simply suggest that translating the energy from this artificial ecology of noise compels us to keep revising our given understandings of who and what counts as human, of who and what counts as rational, and perhaps that's enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Wow, very nice. Oh, I'm once again in the onerous position of hopefully initiating some questions and hopefully not posing one to you, because once again the singular nature of your research is very compelling and very tricky terrain to navigate. Thank you very much. Are there questions for Sean to begin with? Melanie, please.
Hi, Sean. Thanks so much. That was fascinating. And yeah, so much to pick up on there. I'm wondering if you might be willing to forgive my ignorance and share a little bit about what your noise performance looks like.
Yeah, for sure. Shep had asked that earlier. I kind of wish I had included it now somewhere, because I think there's a definite, there's the way I write's definitely like the way I put together noise. And basically I have a little mic and I go around with people and we follow noise and interesting sounds. So we kind of think about the way that our environments are organized. COVID has made this very difficult, but basically how our environments typically are organized according to streets and various establishments. Different areas of different environments are of course segregated according to various histories, and sound tends to be something that, and specifically noise and just interesting sound, seems to be something that ends up mapping like a different terrain. And then basically, you know, with this little mic, then I remix stuff, throw it through various like free software, and then post it online, or try to play it at house shows and stuff like that. But one of my mentors was really insightful. I didn't see a similarity between my projects, but it's kind of also how I approach citations. Anytime I cite, I try to modulate the writing around it in order to kind of take into account style and form and those sorts of things. So yeah, I think noise is just something that's always very much interested me. And specifically, you know, it's one of those terms that, again, like energy, is there seem to be so many different definitions of noise. And I really like this idea that De Silva proposes, that noise is basically this like absence of signification. And how does one, you know, refuse signification at the same time that one, you know, has to communicate according to colonial racial dynamics, is one that I'm very interested in problematizing. And so it's exploratory and experimental. I don't think I've arrived at like a solution. And that's the thing with the aspect of wonder. It seems to be something that any kind of solution can't be proposed in advance, and that's kind of the exciting point of continuing to revise and continuing to experiment. But yeah, as opposed to maybe theory, thinking about it in terms of experiments as experiential things. But thank you.
Thank you. I do have one text idea I can share with you now or in the chat. It's one of the books that I'll mention briefly in my talk, called Endangered Hydrocarbons by Leslie Battler. You may know it. It's in the Energy Humanities Reader. She has a poem called The Petrochemical Ball, and it's made up a lot of sort of imitations of the sounds that hydrocarbons make when they're being refined. So it's got all these like shrieking sounds in them. I've never heard her read the poem, but it would be an interesting one anyway.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I haven't heard of this. It sounds like awesome. I really look forward to reading this. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your talk.
Another question for Sean? Sean, I'll interject. I've always been interested in Aristotle's kind of notion of philosophy beginning in thalamusine or wonder, and the way you set up your argument, it seems that philosophizing can tap into an infinite resource of energy because it can never completely cognize its object of study, which is outside its own kind of limits as contingency. It's setting. Do you think there's ways to like, if that's kind of right, I'm just reading off some of your gestures.
That's way more succinct than I could make it. So thank you, Shep.
But like, do you think there's ways to like actually like reconfigure this and turn it into some kind of like alternate energy resource? Or I mean, when you bring on energy, I'm wondering, oh yeah, well, I mean, but an alternate energy, because obviously wonder is driving me now, and it was driving me as I was listening to your kind of like repeated and recursive, you know, like unrelenting like list of philosophers and ideas. So I mean, I was getting into the formal kind of style of things and the constant overturning of things that were happening, and I was like, thoughts around a pragmatics of wonder as a source for
so thank you so much for the comment. Yeah, that's more of an open question. I mean, I've been searching for text. I mean, I was trying to basically find a very minimal definition that is both specific and also allows for, like the word I've been drawn to is like capacious, a kind of radically inclusive way of understanding the relationship between form and politics is something I've been trying to work on. And also, of course, like, you know, this came up earlier, like the realities of kind of the university machine and publishing, and, you know, how does one intervene? And there's all sorts of interesting ethical and political kind of questions there. But I think that, it's an open question. I see it like it's like so minimum that I kind of see it at work in a lot of different artistic practices. It's this last week, I think I can't remember which discussion it was. I think it was Dominic's presentation on, and I was interested in this question of surfing and its relationship to the flaneur and its relationship to movement, and thinking about how artists break given forms, and then the question of like what seems new, right? Is one that I'm very interested in, because I don't think there really is. It's very difficult to, you know, say that anything's new once one takes recourse to history and understands, you know, historical process and how concepts move in time. And yeah, I don't know. I think that that's why I was originally drawn to genre work, specifically like science fiction, fantasy, horror, and specifically thinking about how artists are using genres that, you know, are pretty self-explanatory at this point. And that's also an entire different kind of market economy. You know, there's always the sci-fi, fantasy, horror section at like a bookstore. And I'm interested in how artists take these forms that seem like, and like, I like to think of them almost as ruins or something metaphorically, and how artists resuscitate some kind of vitality out of forms that, are well established. And so, yeah, I think that I see it a lot. The situationist kind of idea of rerouting is one that I'm interested in. But yeah, and the artists I specifically engage in this project are all kind of doing that with various different genres and movements and stuff, and kind of breaking the genre from inside somehow. And yeah, I think wonder's the motor for that in some way.
Well, you know, it has, you know, when you think of Greenblatt's book on the marvelous, I mean, it definitely has a purchase on the colonial press, the question. And it's like, do you think I always almost wonder, like, the kind of Aristotelian definition, you have to go back to almost first sources, because maybe it's is it a more productive concept or to think at that point, rather than it's like kind of re-emergence and re-evolution for Western European thought in the, you know, from the 14th to the 20th centuries?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's been an interesting process for me of going backwards and trying to, like, understand where some of these concepts, basic concepts like distinction and division, like, where does that come from? And I'm really interested in kind of these moments where, like, for example, my recent interest in Descartes, which I just never would have thought would have happened, is because he seems so, like, weirded out by his discovery of wonder and the passions in particular. And that seems to be something that he relegates in his thinking. And I'm wondering about the effects throughout history of that kind of process of, like, because it's really interesting. There's like a system of, like, almost like Montesquieuian checks and balances that he has with there's like a political economy operating in Descartes' work, which is like the exiling of astonishment in order to regulate the sense of wonder. And I'm wondering, why that is, and the effects of that. So yeah, I think going back to sources and kind of picking that stuff apart is definitely, and that plays into as well, it returns to, like, how I think about music composition or decomposition and finding samples and found things, or cinema, found footage, like that sort of stuff. But yeah.
Wow, interesting. Hopefully we can come back to you as well as Arthur and Melanie. Thank you very much. Let me introduce our final speaker today, Melanie Dennis Unrau. Dr. Melanie Dennis Unrau, she, her, is a settler of mixed European ancestry living on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. Melanie is a visiting fellow at St. John's College at the University of Manitoba and a research affiliate at the University of Manitoba Institute for the Humanities. She's author of Happiness Threads, The Unborn Poems from 2013, co-editor of Seriality and Texts for Young People, The Compulsion to Repeat from 2014, and a former editor of G's Magazine and The Goose, a journal of arts, environment, and culture in Canada. Melanie's working on a book titled The Rough Poets, Petropolitics and the Tradition of Canadian Oil Worker Poetry, which is on contract with McGill, Queen's University Press. Her lecture today is titled Boom Time, Giant Time, and Other Elsewhens of Lindsay Bird's Boom Time. Please welcome Melanie Dennis Unrau.
Thanks so much. And I'm planning to share my screen too. Oh, great, thank you. All right, I'm sticking with the bread and butter, Sean, so I'll be the close reader today. I'd like to begin by thanking Shep Steiner, Bick Vanderpool, and everyone at Mosaic Journal for this opportunity to think about my literary and cultural studies work on petropoetics and oil worker poetry in terms of time. Conceiving of petropoetics not only as poetry and artistic creation, but also more broadly as practices of creation, world making, and simply living with fossil fuels, I consider oil worker poets to be expert practitioners and theorists of petropoetics. My readings of oil worker poetry focus on how it attends to and subverts the poetics of the settler colonial petrostate, including its structures of feeling, discourses, class relations, and land relations. I'm a bit embarrassed to realize how little attention I have paid so far to time, despite the way it emerges as an increasingly obvious theme in the oil worker poetry that I study. Well, may have to just work out some kinks with my PowerPoint, sorry. With the most recent titles, including Endangered Hydrocarbons, Boom Time, and Moving to Climate Change Hours, the 3 books you can see on this slide. And despite the fact that many of the concerns that animate current scholarly work in the environmental and energy humanities are concerns about time, for instance, climate change, decolonization, extinction, apocalypse, the Anthropocene, and energy transition, I have some work to do around petropoetics and time. My talk today is a reading of Lindsay Bird's 2019 poetry collection, Boom Time. This talk focuses on the theories of time the text advances in and for itself. Then it extrapolates and takes some imaginative leaps from there. Like many of the oil worker poets I study, Bird is reluctant to criticize the oil sands industry that employs so many hardworking people and that helped her pay off her student debts. Her poetry also makes almost no reference to the indigenous peoples on Treaty 8 territory, the Cree, Chipewyan, Dene, and Métis peoples whose homes, territories, cultures, and well-being are intertwined with and profoundly impacted by the oil sands industry. My reading of and between the lines of Boom Time therefore takes liberties in its attention to what is implicit, unspoken, or repressed in this text's handling of time. Lindsay Bird is a poet and CBC journalist of unmarked ancestry and land relations who grew up in Toronto and who now lives in Corner Brook, Newfoundland. Her first poetry collection, Boom Time, was published by Gaspereau Press in 2019. Boom Time is a sequence of semi-autobiographical lyric poems based on the 2 years Bird spent living at work camps and working at mining and construction sites near Fort McMurray, Alberta, between 2006 and 2008. Bird's post-undergraduate stint working in the oil sands coincided with the height of an oil boom that turned to bust with the financial crisis and recession of 2008. The book is set during the boom, but it was written during the succession of recuperations, declines, and busts that came after, including the tragic 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire known as the Beast, and also austerity measures, including increased automation of oil sands jobs. Boom Time therefore layers a tone of suspicion, irony, or prescience over the mostly present tense narration by a reticent, impersonal, mostly first-person narrator who lives in the moment, her words offering imaginative and playful imagery for her experiences and surroundings, while glancing off the emotions and traumas involved in being one of the few women in an oil sands work camp. Bird's multi-layered and onomatopoeic title is emphasized on the dust jacket, shown on this slide, which is made of beige construction paper stock with a debossed sepia-colored pen and ink drawing of an oil sands refinery under construction along the bottom, extending from the back to the front cover. Near the top of the front cover, stamped into the paper like the treads of a tire or a shoe, are the staggered words Boom Time, spelled in all caps, in oversized font the color of dried blood. The word time is offset in a way that suggests motion, as if it were about to pounce on the poet's name, which is printed in smaller, mixed case sepia font near the open maw of the letter E. The effect of noise, violence, power, and dissonant scale jumping is reinforced with the page turn past the bitumen black cover pages to an inside cover, shown on this slide, with the same heavy-set title, this time in bright blood red, hovering like the underside of a boot above a drawing of an oil sands work camp, shrinking the camp dwellers standing outside their ATCO trailer residences to ant size. Then comes the turn to the opening poem, First Day in Fort Mac, where the speaker and other newcomers, quote, stumble off the bus in our new boots to see what eats grass and what eats us, end quote. The narrator scrambles to position herself in an industry food chain that treats virtually everything, fossilized prehistoric life, lakes, forests, muskeg, nearby communities, and human and non-human lives, as available to be turned into money or fuel. The work camp she has arrived at is a residential camp for transient workers, also known as a man camp, a toxic and dangerous location notorious for harmful effects on nearby communities, and especially on Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. Boom time in the vicinity of the town, sometimes referred to as Fort McMoney, offers the narrator a chance to make quick cash, as long as she can handle the violence, that is, the deprivation, endangerment, and culpability involved in oil sands work. Boom time. Boom time is, as its title suggests, about time, specifically about the strange, short temporality of boom time as experienced by an educated yet unskilled worker temporarily employed as part of a transient workforce, unmoored in relation to both place and time. The title poem begins, "We swing fat and hammocked between bust and bust, feet up on the leather ottoman that signifies the good life." As shown on this slide, the text of the poem zigzags or swerves, unhinged from the left justified form of most of the other poems in the book. Turned sideways, I read this as a concrete poem. It resembles the graphs of resource prices that chart the boom and bust cycles to which the poem refers. See, for example, this graph produced by the Narwhal using data from the Alberta government to chart the price per barrel of Western Canadian Select from January 2006 to March 2020. That's a kind of crude oil. The imagery of Bird's first stanza is complex and uses mixed metaphors. It conflates the graph with its roller coaster-like ups and downs with the experiences and the lives of an indeterminate we. This we may refer to industry workers. It may refer to all Canadians who ostensibly benefit from trickle-down petroeconomics in a petrostate, or it may refer to Anthropocene humans careening toward catastrophic climate change. In any of these cases, it privileges, or perhaps parodies, an elite subset of these groups, while marginalizing or perhaps siding with those who experience boom time differently. The poem constructs an image of this we swinging in a hammock between bust and bust. The image is tethered unexpectedly to bust time, as if the bust and not the boom were inevitable. If I look at the graph and try to draw in the hammock, I can put it under the plot, as shown on this slide, dangling and seemingly detached below, but it doesn't feel like I have the image right until I invert the graph, making the busts the highest data points and letting the hammock swing into the depths of the boom. And I want to thank my son Sheldon for the hammock drawing on this slide. There are a few things to observe about this image once I draw it out like this. First, following Denise Ferreira de Silva's excellent lecture during this symposium, I note that decoding this image creates a shadow graph that registers boom as deficit and loss, a medium to chart the negative, undesirable, and often unnoticed objects that accumulate during boom time. This is what Anishinaabe economist and water protector Winona LeDuc calls Wendigo economics, quote, a system based on colonization, wastefulness, and ravenous greed, a system that destroys the very source of its own wealth and well-being, Mother Earth, end quote. An inverted chart of boom time is a diagram of extraction. The boom is an open pit mine that deepens as it grows. Second, if we think of the boom and bust cycle as a roller coaster that we ride in a petroeconomy, the hammock between busts represents boom time as a time when workers and other beneficiaries are buffered from the minor ups and downs. Of course, the wealth and comfort of oil sands workers who can afford, for instance, a leather ottoman or a fancy truck is exaggerated and stereotyped in a culture where they often become the scapegoats of consumerist excess, where they can too easily be criticized as perpetrators of ecocide and squanderers of resources, while they are also treated as dispendable human resources by the corporations, executives, and elites they work for, and while they are in fact working long hours, doing difficult and dangerous labor, and often living far away from their homes, families, and furniture. Third, this image demonstrates how the resource economy creates and exacerbates the scalar mismatches that characterize our energy system and the dominant colonial land relations that subtend it. The human who lounges in this image is an Anthropocene or colonizing human, a giant with an oversized carbon footprint, which we might also think of as a time footprint, who, by over-consuming finite resources and emitting pollution, creates the conditions of scarcity expressed in the poem's second stanza in the proclamation that, quote, "we've made it for a limited time only," end quote. In contrast to indigenous and anti-colonial notions of good land relations as involving reciprocity, relationship, and taking up one's responsibilities to the land that sustains us, the hammock, the ottoman, and the price index itself represent tragic misrecognitions of the good life. My thinking here is indebted to Winona LaDuke's, Leanne Betasomosake Simpson's, and Louis Bird's explanations of the Anishinaabe and Cree conceptions of the good life as Mino Bimatisoin and Pimatisoin. Also to Max Leboiron's and Zoe Todd's writings about good land relations. And I'll just put the poem back up so we can look at the second stanza now. The title of the boom time poem may seem to privilege the chart and hammock metaphor for what boom time is, but like the someone on the radio who declares in the second stanza that we've made it, a supposed authority whose only qualification is that they sound bespectacled, the narrator of the poetry collection is also unreliable, merely speculating, passing on rumors she hears in the work camp, and grasping for language and imagery. The other poems in the book provide a range of other metaphors. Boom time is watching concrete dry, or shoveling dirt from one pile to another. It's tailings ponds that resemble droopy drawers, period underwear, but with a shimmer you can't help but be drawn toward. It's a tragedy on Highway 63, also known as the Highway of Death. Boom time is buying a pet lizard, then deciding to take a trip and leaving the lizard at the bus terminal to freeze in the snow. Boom time is having an affair and making love while listening to the downstairs neighbor being beaten by her spouse. It's throwing a rager at Gregoire Lake through a northern summer night when dusk touches dawn and the sun barely sets. And it is working through a winter day, quote, as the sun barely lifts a bored eyebrow to the horizon, end quote. In the temporality structured by shift work, turnarounds, and trips home, boom time is often about filling time and killing time, with parties, TV, and old-fashioned binge watching with DVD box sets, with knitting, DIY tattoos, and outrageous bets, with homesick rituals like a Newfoundland screech-in where you kiss a flown-in cod, and with gossip, harassment, humiliation, and threats, with blending in, keeping your head down and going along with things that make you uncomfortable, from groping superintendents to pollution and ecocide. Bird's empathetic narrative poems portray precarious and toxic working and living conditions with measures of kindness, sorrow, solidarity, and oblivion. Scattered throughout Bird's boom time is a sequence of elsewhere poems with titles such as Elsewhere Number 1, Eaton's, etc. Each poem is a flashback to the narrator's childhood or young adult life before going to work in Fort McMurray. Flashbacks to shopping at the Eaton's department store, or to a camping disaster on a family road trip, or to other scenes from a time that the narrator places before the decline of the empire. The narrator is nostalgic not only for the elsewheres of her memories, but also for her own naivete in unrecoverable and unredeemable elsewhens. The elsewhere poems conjure a settler colonial capitalist optimism that journalist Chris Turner describes in his History of the Oil Sands as, quote, the high modern ideal of progress that defined the 20th century, that trust in bigger machines and better technology to fuel the good life, end quote. Turner argues, simplistically, that the first oil sands mega projects were built and the industry was born during the dominance of such a high modernist ideal, and that the industry is now caught unfairly in a clash between that old ideal and a 21st century ecological one. Bird's elsewhere poems may express a wish to work in the industry at a time when she wouldn't have to feel so badly about it. Living in 21st century boom time involves knowing that the results of modernist projects, such as the oil sands, Canadian colonialism, and the global energy system, are depletion, pollution, dispossession, and extinction. The poem's safety reminder recites a camp legend, a murmured lunchroom tale about Donnie, a worker who slipped and was sucked into a tailings pond. As shown on this slide, it ends with another else when, or perhaps an or else when. The tailings ponds will eat you whole, and in 1,000 years, whoever's left to wander this wasted muskeg won't find a single human bone. This else when is a terminus of settler colonial imagination. The only end of extraction it can imagine is one in which the humans have taken everything and either died off or abandoned the uninhabitable land. Echoing the use of the noun waste, following John Locke as a settler colonial term that deems Indigenous land underutilized and justifies its appropriation, wasted is, as petrocultural scholar Jennifer Wenzel has observed, an adjective used to describe colonized land treated as overburden and laid waste by extraction. In the context of an industry that treats Indigenous homelands as sacrifice zones, one might speculate that the barely imagined survivor in the Athabasca region in 1,000 years is an Indigenous person. As Potawatomi scholar Kyle Powys-White has argued about Indigenous climate studies, Indigenous peoples have a longer conception of time that can reach beyond what he calls, quote, brief but highly disruptive colonial, capitalist, and industrial periods, end quote. And that can conceive of being the whoever's left that Bird's speaker struggles to imagine. Safety reminder gestures bleakly and perhaps unconsciously beyond boom time to the existence of knowledges and practices for survival, even in a post-extraction wasteland. And of course, this connects with what Sean was saying about the apocalypse having already happened. One more sip here, sorry. Giant time. In a different imagined sequence of else ones, the unreliable narrator of Boom Time imagines Giant Time as both preceding and following Boom Time. Early in the collection, in the poem titled Orientation, the narrator speculates, as shown on this slide, this is where the last giants lived when the world decided to shrink to reasonable size. And you only find that out after the waivers, left to gawk at the ankles of everything. This speculative thread is picked up again in the final poem of the collection, titled Giant Time, which imagines the post-apocalyptic return of the giants who have, quote, only been just over the hill this whole time, end quote. In the wasted landscape that was the oil sands, the giants make themselves at home again. The stanzas on this slide read, they snuggle rumps around in mine pits, a muddy lingerie, snap smokestacks into cigars, lean back, puff and sigh, finally put that vast sky into perspective. This playful, time-based explanation for the astonishing scale of oil sands mines and heavy hauler trucks the size of two-story houses resonates with the front cover images I showed earlier. It recalls Anglo-centric giant tales such as Jack and the Beanstalk and the long-running Canadian children's television series, The Friendly Giant. It also calls to mind aerial photographs of the oil sands by Edward Bertinsky, Warren Carreyrou, and Louis Helbig, particularly some of Helbig's images, which really evoke the sense that the trucks, pipes, and ATCO trailers they depict might be children's building blocks and other toys. And I offer some who are substitutes for Helbig's images on the next couple of slides. These are photos I took myself on a research trip to Fort McMurray, the first showing a work camp. The giants may seem fantastical, and perhaps they are merely a fantasy, a diversion from accounting for the avarice and greed it takes for Anthropocene humans, especially corporate and government elites, to lounge, smoke, and frolic amid the suffering of others. Yet the giants are also threatening, and the post-human time they inhabit serves as a warning, an or else when of Boom Time that I wish to consider briefly as the return of the Wendigo or Weedigo. Leduc writes, in our Anishinaabe stories, the Wendigo is a giant murderous monster that used to rampage through the North Woods, fueled by an insatiable greed and a relentless desire for human flesh. Fossil fuel era capitalism is like the Wendigo, a predator economics, the economics of a cannibal. A similar once human giant monster exists in many indigenous traditions, including the Cree Weedigo stories told in the oil sands region. Anishinaabe scholar Basil Johnston describes the fearsome Wendigo as a warning against greed and selfishness and an exhortation to practice moderation. He describes corporations, conglomerates, and multinationals as modern Wendigos. In Dr.Braith author Richard Van Camp's short story On the Wings of This Prayer, a person from the future sends a message back to the present day about a zombie apocalypse to come, a world where oil sands extraction has brought back the Weedigo. They say, you must stop the tar sands. Do not bring cancer to our mother. Do not unleash them. Together, Van Camp's story and Leduc's Wendigo economics recast as Wendigo the venerated founding fathers of the oil sands, as well as the Boom Time workers who are likewise, as Boom writes in the poem The Peter Pond Mall, in search of a buck, a beaver pelt, bitumen, whatever's in demand with the white man. Those of us who are equally guilty of putting our feet up as beneficiaries of an ecocidal industry are also Wendigos, especially those who profit most and have their hammocks hitched the highest, who move around resources workers, indigenous communities, ATCO trailers, land and water as if they were toys. This is the unspeakable shadow story of Lindsay Bird's Boomtime, the cannibalism that links Boomtime with Giant Time. A shadow reading of Boomtime suggests a politics that Leduc describes as being a water protector and a Wendigo slayer. And I'm closing here a little abruptly, I know, with the wish that we may each find ways to do the anti-colonial, reciprocal, and relational work of just energy transition in our own communities and in solidarity with Indigenous and other communities on the front lines of extraction and protection. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Very nice. Questions for Melanie?
Hello to Ijoma. Oh, she's gone. Hi, sweetie.
Did you say the author came from Newfoundland, Melanie?
Yes, she lives in Newfoundland now, but she grew up in Toronto.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I was wondering because there's such a, when I've flown through the Edmonton International Airport, I always know, you know, it's a main hub for Fort McMurray. And I imagine that there was a lot of labor force drawn from the East Coast, the Atlantic provinces. And I imagined that there might have been some kind of connection with the collapse of the fishing industry. So there, you know, one minor apocalypse leading to another, not minor, localized, which is, you know, the scale is massive in any case.
Yeah. I'm reading this book right now, Extracting Home in the Oil Sands, Settler Colonialism and Environmental Change in Subarctic Canada. So it's a lot of historians and anthropologists, etc. But they're writing about those histories and those convergences of people in that region. And according to them, and also according to Bird, sort of anecdotally, there were lots of people from Newfoundland especially, and from the Maritimes.
Mm.
One person who I find it neat to know that she worked together with Lindsay Bird is the comic artist Kate Beaton, who makes the Hark a Vagrant comics, or did, and who is coming out with a graphic novel about that experience titled Ducks. It's coming out later this year. And she grew up in Nova Scotia, I believe, and moved to Fort Mac after finishing her undergrad degree. I see Sean's hand.
Hey, thank you so much. I had a question. So in the project you're working on, are you primarily analyzing poetry and its relationship to the various other fields you're working on? Or are you looking at, for example, graphic novels, like the example that you shared with us and stuff? And depending on that, like, how do you negotiate different forms of media and how there might be differences or similarities between them in your research? Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for that question. I am primarily working with poetry. This is my dissertation to book project. So I wrote a dissertation on poetry written by oil workers in Canada. I have brought in a little bit of Beaton's comics in conversation with some of the other writing about the oil sands. And I don't know that I have a really great description of like a methodology for working with different genres, but I feel like I sort of showed how I often have quite a visual way of engaging with the poetry that I'm working with. So for instance, Kate Beaton has these comics she calls Founding Fathers in a Tailings Pond and Founding Fathers in an Amusement Park, where she sort of takes American founding fathers out of time and plunks them in these modern settings. So I tried to sort of do the same thing with one of the founding fathers of the oil sands in some of my work, and it's been fun.
You definitely fleshed out some meanings out of those first two stanzas by virtue of those visuals. And it didn't occur to me that you were satirizing the poem at all. But like, I have to wonder, well, no, I don't even have to wonder. I mean, I do. Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interpretive work being done. And I'm stuck on intention to some extent when I read poetry. And tell me, what do you think the limits are of her own poetics? I mean, just that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know exactly where the limit is in relationship to the things that I've argued here, but I definitely feel that I'm sort of taking what Bird seems to be doing and sort of leaping from there, which is how I like to do creative work in literary and cultural studies.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is often a thing with people who've worked in this industry that they don't want to speak poorly. They don't want to overtly speak poorly of the industry. So that when Matthew Henderson talks about The Lease, which is another great poetry collection about oil work, he says that it's not political. And I just find it uninteresting to take him at his word on that. So I do sort of push into his considerations of what a lease is, and the sort of land relations that are foundational to extractive industry. And of course, this workshop series has made me think, oh, there's so much to think about time in terms of the lease too, which anyway, I expect that Lindsay Bird wouldn't agree with everything that I say, for sure. And I have heard her, for instance, say that when she says something is about before the decline of empire, she was talking about the Eden store, right? Sure, but I also find this resonance sort of beyond that limit that she's placed on how the poem can be interpreted, right?
Like I was struck by the kind of retrospective, like, account of the whole what you recounted. And if there is a politics or critical edge to it, it is all retrospective.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Do you think she's one of the strongest Petro poets working?
Sure. Right now, I'm working on a special issue on the theme of poetics and extraction for Canadian Literature Journal. So we're trying to put together a group of poets who might comment on that theme for us. And so I'm thinking about that question, and it's hard to choose, but I think so. I mentioned Leslie Battler, who describes her work in political terms, in more political terms. So she says things like language is the militant arm of science, and as a sort of language generator for Shell formerly, she participated in a particular way, and she's trying to participate through her poetics, which is kind of a poetics of extraction and remixing in doing something specifically sort of ideological, like engaging at the level of ideology, right?
Mhm.
So in terms of having articulated what like this kind of poetry or poetics might do, probably Leslie Battler has done the most that I know of. I also study a book called Rig Talk by Peter Christensen. It was published in the 1980s by Thistledown Press, and it received very little attention. I think a lot of people were offended by it. But I do a reading of this book as sort of an analysis of sort of Rig Talk as ideological language or as discourse in the petrostate, and that Christensen was making some pretty incredible observations that or maybe people weren't ready to hear.
Really?
So yeah, it's been really interesting work for sure.
Cool.
Thanks for
Any
those
other-
great questions.
Any other questions? Sean or Melanie or Arthur? All right, good. Thank you very much, everyone. Please join us for the final episodes of the lecture in March. Thank you, Melanie, Arthur, and Sean.